The October wind carried the scent of winter across the valley, stirring the cottonwoods that bordered Will Carter's ranch like silent sentinels. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his parents beneath those same trees. 3 years since he'd spoken more than a dozen words to another living soul. His weathered hands gripped the tin coffee cup, still warm against the evening chill. The coal oil lamp flickered behind him in the kitchen window, casting his shadow long across the porch boards his father had cut and fitted with his own hands. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, a storm gathering strength in the darkness. Will had learned to read such signs in this wild country, learned that change came sudden and fierce as prairie lightning. He drained the last bitter dregs of coffee and turned toward the house. Behind him, the wind picked up, setting the porch swing creaking on its hemp ropes like a restless ghost. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Will Carter's ranch like silent sentinels. Years had passed since he'd buried his parents beneath those same trees. Years since he'd spoken more than a dozen words to another living soul. Weathered hands gripped the tin coffee cup, still warm against the evening chill. The coal oil lamp flickered behind him in the kitchen window, casting his shadow long across the porch boards his father had cut and fitted with his own hands. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, a storm gathering strength in the darkness. Will had learned to read such signs in this wild country, learned that change came sudden and fierce as prairie lightning. He drained the last bitter dregs of coffee and turned toward the house. Behind him, the wind picked up, setting the porch swing creaking on its hemp ropes like a restless ghost. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the inside the ranch house. Will moved through his evening ritual with the precision of a man who had performed these same actions countless times. He washed his tin cup in the granite basin, dried it with a flour sack towel, and placed it on the wooden shelf his father had mounted beside the cast-iron stove. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across the pine walls, illuminating the family Bible that lay open on the kitchen table. His mother's handwriting filled the margins: birth dates, death dates, brief notes about weather and harvests. Will born during the blizzard of '52. Papa's finest colt. The ink had faded to brown, but her careful script remained clear. He settled into his father's rocking chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The seat bore the worn impression of 2 generations of Carter men who had ended their days here, watching flames dance behind the stove's glass door. Will opened the Bible to Psalms, as was his custom, but tonight the words blurred together. 3 years ago, this kitchen had hummed with life, his mother's voice singing hymns while she kneaded bread dough, his father's boots scraping the doorframe as he carried in armloads of split oak. Now silence filled every corner like dust. The grandfather clock in the parlor chimed 9 times. Soon the lamp would burn low, and he would climb the narrow stairs to his childhood bedroom. Tomorrow would bring the same routine: checking cattle, mending fence, eating solitary meals while the empty chairs watched him like accusers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Will closed the Bible and touched the pressed wildflower that marked his place: Indian paintbrush. His mother had picked the spring before she took sick. The petals crumbled slightly under his calloused fingertip. A sound carried on the wind made him pause. Not the usual night chorus of coyotes or the settling timber of barn walls. Something else. Something that made the hair on his neck prickle with an awareness he couldn't name. He rose from the chair and moved to the window, cupping his hands against the glass to peer into the darkness. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating storm clouds that promised rain before morning. But there was the sound of wagon wheels on the rocky trail that led to his ranch. He washed his tin cup in the granite basin, dried it with a flour sack towel, and placed it on the wooden shelf his father had mounted beside the cast-iron stove. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across the pine walls, illuminating the family Bible that lay open on the kitchen table. His mother's handwriting filled the margins: birth dates, death, dates, brief notes about weather and harvests. During the blizzard of 52, Papa's finest. The ink had faded to brown. Careful script remained clear. He settled into his father's rocking chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The seat bore the worn impression of two generations of Carter men who had ended their days here, watching flames dance behind the stove's glass door. Will opened the Bible to Psalms, as was his custom, but tonight the words blurred together. 3 years ago, this kitchen had hummed with life, his mother's voice singing hymns while she kneaded bread dough, his father's boots scraping the doorframe as he carried in armloads of split oak. Now silence filled every corner like dust. The grandfather clock in the parlor chimed 9 times. Soon the lamp would burn low, and he would climb the narrow stairs to his childhood bedroom. Tomorrow would bring the same routine: checking cattle, mending fence, eating solitary meals while the empty chairs watched him like accusers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the Will closed the Bible and touched the pressed wildflower that marked his place. Indian paintbrush his mother had picked the spring before she took sick. The petals crumbled slightly under his calloused fingertip. A sound carried on the wind made him pause. Not the usual night chorus of coyotes or the settling timber of barn walls. Something else. Something that made the hair on his neck prickle with an awareness he couldn't name. He rose from the chair and moved to the window, cupping his hands against the glass, to peer into the darkness. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating storm clouds that promised rain before. But there was the sound of wagon wheels on the rocky trail that led to his. Will extinguished the lamp and stepped onto the porch, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The storm was closer now, lightning illuminating the valley in brief, stark flashes that revealed windswept grass and the skeletal branches of bare trees. There it was again, the unmistakable creak and rattle of a wagon moving fast over rough ground. But who would be traveling these back trails at night, especially with weather moving in? The nearest town lay 15 miles east, and most folks had sense enough to seek shelter before dark when storms threatened. Thunder rolled across the valley like the voice of an angry god. In its wake, Will heard something else that made his blood chill: the high, frightened whinny of a horse pushed beyond endurance. He stepped down from the porch, his bare feet finding purchase on the packed earth of the yard. Lightning flashed again, longer this time, and in that moment of white brilliance he saw them, a wagon careening down the slope toward his ranch, listing badly to one side, as if a wheel had worked loose. The driver fought to control 2 lathered horses that stumbled with exhaustion. Even at this distance, Will could see the wagon carried more than one person. A woman's voice carried on the wind, calling out words he couldn't distinguish but whose terror he understood perfectly. Without hesitation, Will ran toward the barn for his lantern, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The storm was closer now, lightning illuminating the valley. In brief, stark flashes that revealed windswept grass and the skeletal branches of bare trees. There it was again, the unmistakable creak and rattle of a wagon moving fast over rough ground. But who would be traveling these back trails at night, especially with weather moving in? The nearest town lay 15 miles east. Most folks had sense enough to seek shelter before dark when storms threatened. Thunder rolled across the valley like the voice of an angry god. In its wake, Will heard something else that made his blood chill: the high, frightened whinny of a horse pushed beyond endurance. He stepped down from the porch, his bare feet finding purchase on the packed earth of the yard. Lightning flashed again, longer this time, and in that moment of white brilliance he saw them, a wagon careening down the slope toward his ranch, listing badly to one side as if a wheel had worked loose. The driver fought to control 2 lathered horses that stumbled with exhaustion. Even at this distance, Will could see the wagon carried more than one person. A woman's voice carried on the wind, calling out words he couldn't distinguish but whose terror he understood perfectly. Without hesitation, Will ran toward the barn for his. Earlier that evening, Helen Morrison had stood in the doorway of her late husband's cabin, watching 3 riders approach through the gathering dusk. She knew the lead rider's silhouette before he dismounted. Marcus Blackwood's broad shoulders and expensive hat were as recognizable as they were unwelcome. Mrs. Morrison. Blackwood removed his hat with mock courtesy, his pale eyes taking in the cabin's weathered boards and sagging porch. I trust you've had time to consider my proposal. Helen kept her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. I told you last week, Mr. Blackwood, I'm not interested in marriage, to you or anyone else. Her children pressed against her skirts. Tommy, 8 years old and trying to stand brave like his father had taught him, and Sarah, barely 6, who clutched her cornhusk doll with white knuckles. They sensed danger even if they couldn't understand its nature. Blackwood smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. I'm afraid you misunderstood. This isn't a request. Helen. He drew a folded document from his coat. Your late husband owed considerable money. The banknote comes due next month. Robert never borrowed from you. No, but the Cattleman's Bank did, and I own the Cattleman's Bank. Blackwood unfolded the paper with deliberate care. $300, plus interest, due in full by November 1st. Helen's heart sank. $300 might as well have been $3,000. The small garden and handful of chickens barely provided food, let alone cash money. Of course, Blackwood continued, his voice smooth as snake oil. Marriage would settle all debts immediately. You'd have security, a fine house in town, your children would want for nothing. And what would you have? Helen asked, though she dreaded the answer. His smile turned predatory. A wife who understands her place, children who know the value of obedience, and this land, which sits conveniently between my holdings and the railroad survey. Tommy stepped forward, his young voice fierce with protective anger. Mama don't want to marry you. You can't make her. Blackwood's hand moved to the riding crop at his belt. Boy needs to learn manners. Touch my son and I'll kill you myself. Helen's words rang with such deadly conviction that Blackwood actually stepped back. Such fire. He chuckled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. You have until tomorrow evening to reconsider. After that, I'll foreclose and you'll leave with nothing, or you can be sensible and say yes now. Get off my land. Blackwood replaced his hat, his expression hardening. Tomorrow, Helen. Don't make this harder than necessary. The moment the riders disappeared into the darkness, Helen sprang into action. She pulled her children inside and began throwing their few possessions into Quilt's clothes. The family Bible, Robert's letters, her grandmother's silver locket. Her hands shook, but her mind remained clear. Mama, where are we going? Sarah's voice quavered. Away from here, sweetheart. We're going to find somewhere safe. Tommy helped pack their meager food supplies while Helen hitched their old mare to the wagon. The horse was tired and past her prime, but she was all they had. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a rough night ahead. Will we ever come back? Tommy asked as they climbed into the wagon. Helen took one last look at the cabin where she'd been happy, where her children had been born, where Robert's presence still lingered in every corner. No, son, we won't. She snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward into the night. The storm caught them 2 hours later, turning the dirt road into a treacherous mudslide. Rain lashed their faces and soaked through their woolen cloaks. Sarah whimpered with cold and fear while Tommy tried to shield her with his small body. Helen fought to control the terrified mare as lightning split the sky in jagged forks. She had no idea where they were. The familiar landmarks had vanished in the darkness and driving rain. They could be miles from any shelter, or completely lost in the wilderness. Mama, I'm scared, Sarah sobbed. I know, baby girl. Mama's scared too. Helen pulled her daughter closer with one arm while maintaining her grip on the reins with the other. But sometimes being scared means we're being brave. Papa always said that. A wheel hit a deep rut, and the wagon tilted sickeningly. For a heart-stopping moment, Helen thought they would tip over completely, but the mare struggled forward, and the wagon righted itself with a violent jolt that threw them against each other, through the rain and lightning. Helen glimpsed something that made her cry out with relief, a distant light flickering through the trees. A farmhouse, or ranch, someone's home where they might find shelter from the storm. She urged the exhausted mare toward the light, praying that whoever lived there would have pity on a desperate woman and her children. Behind them, the darkness seemed to pursue like a living thing, full of threats and Blackwood's promises of consequence. The wagon bounced over the final stretch of rocky ground as thunder crashed overhead. Helen could see the house clearly now, a solid, well-built structure with warm light glowing in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. "Hold on," she told her children as they approached the porch. "We're almost safe." She had no way of knowing if the people inside would welcome strangers on a night like this. She could only hope that kindness still existed somewhere in this hard country, and that they had found it before it was too late. Blackwood removed his hat with mock courtesy, his pale eyes taking in the cabin's weathered boards and sagging porch. "I trust you've had time to consider my proposal." Helen kept her voice steady despite the fear, clawing at her throat. "I told you last week." "Blackwood, I'm not interested in marriage, to you or anyone else." Her children pressed against her skirts. Tommy, 8 years, old and trying to stand brave like his father had taught him, and Sarah, barely 6, who clutched her cornhusk doll with white knuckles. They sensed danger even if they couldn't understand its nature. Blackwood smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I'm afraid you misunderstood. This isn't a request." "Helen," he drew a folded document from his coat. "Your late husband owed considerable money. Comes due next month. Robert never borrowed from you." "No, but the cattleman's bank did, and I own the cattleman's bank." Blackwood unfolded the paper with deliberate care. "Plus interest. In full by November." Helen's heart sank. Might as well have been. The small garden and handful of chickens barely provided food, let alone cash money. "Of course," Blackwood continued, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Marriage would settle all debts immediately. You'd have security, a fine house in town. Your children would want for nothing." "And what would you have?" Helen asked, though she dreaded the answer. His smile turned predatory. "A wife who understands her place. Children who know the value of obedience. And this land, which sits conveniently between my holdings and the railroad survey." Tommy stepped forward, his young voice fierce with protective anger. "Mama don't want to marry you. You can't make her." Blackwood's hand moved to the riding crop at his belt. "Boy needs to learn manners. Touch my son and I'll kill you myself." Helen's words rang with such deadly conviction that Blackwood actually stepped back. "Such fire!" He chuckled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "You have until tomorrow evening to reconsider. After that, I'll foreclose and you'll leave with nothing, or you can be sensible and say, 'Yes, now. Get off my land.'" Blackwood replaced his hat, his expression hardening. "Tomorrow, Helen. Don't make this harder than necessary." The moment the riders disappeared into the darkness, Helen sprang into action. She pulled her children inside and began throwing their few possessions into Quilt's clothes, the family Bible, Robert's letters, her grandmother's silver locket. Her hands shook, but her mind remained clear. "Mama!" "Where are we going?" Sarah's voice quavered. "Away from here, sweetheart. We're going to find somewhere safe." Tommy helped pack their meager food supplies while Helen hitched their old mare to the wagon. The horse was tired, but she was all they had. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a rough night ahead. "Will we ever come back?" Tommy asked as they climbed into the wagon. Helen took one last look at the cabin, where she'd been happy, where her children had been born, where Robert's presence still lingered in every corner. "No, son, we won't." She snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward into the night. The storm caught them 2 hours later, turning the dirt road into a treacherous mudslide. Rain lashed their faces and soaked through their woolen cloaks. Sarah whimpered with cold and fear while Tommy tried to shield her with his small body. Helen fought to control the terrified mare as Lightning split the sky in jagged forks. She had no idea where they were. The familiar landmarks had vanished in the darkness and driving rain. They could be miles from any shelter or completely lost in the wilderness. "Mama, I'm scared," Sarah sobbed. "I know, baby girl. Scared too." Helen pulled her daughter closer with one arm, while maintaining her grip on the reins with the other. But sometimes being scared means we're being brave. Papa always said that. A wheel hit a deep rut and the wagon tilted sickeningly. For a heart-stopping moment, Helen thought they would tip over completely. But the mare struggled forward, and the wagon righted itself with a violent jolt that threw them against each other. Through the rain and lightning, Helen glimpsed something that made her cry out. With relief, a distant light flickering through the trees. A farmhouse or ranch. Someone's home where they might find shelter from the storm. She urged the exhausted mare toward the light, praying that whoever lived there would have pity on a desperate woman and her children. Behind them, the darkness seemed to pursue like a living thing, full of threats and black woods, promises of consequence. The wagon bounced over the final stretch of rocky ground as thunder crashed overhead. Helen could see the house clearly now, a solid, well-built structure with warm light glowing in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. "Hold on," she told her children as they approached the porch. "We're almost safe." She had no way of knowing if the people inside would welcome strangers on a night like this. She could only hope that kindness still existed somewhere in this hard country and that they had found it before it was too. Will had barely reached the barn when the wagon careened into his yard, the exhausted mare stumbling to a halt near his porch steps. Through the driving rain, he could see a woman struggling to control the reins while two small figures huddled beside her, all three soaked to the bone. Lightning illuminated their faces for a brief moment, pure terror mixed with desperate hope. The woman's dark hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her eyes held the wild look of a cornered animal seeking any refuge from the storm. "Help us, please." Her voice barely carried over the thunder, but Will heard the raw desperation in those words. He ran to the wagon without hesitation, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the muddy yard. "Ma'am, take the children inside. I'll see to your horse." The woman hesitated, clutching her children closer. We don't mean to impose. We just need shelter from the storm. This ain't weather for talking." Will set down the lantern and reached up to help the smallest child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6. She flinched away from his hands, pressing her face against her mother's shoulder. "It's all right, Sarah," the woman murmured. "The gentleman wants to help us." Will kept his voice gentle, the way he'd spoken to spooked horses. "That's right, little miss. Just want to get you out of this rain." He lifted the child carefully, feeling how she trembled with cold and fear. Her dress was soaked through, and her lips had a bluish tinge that worried him. The boy, older, maybe 8, climbed down on his own, though his legs shook with exhaustion. He positioned himself protectively between Will and his mother, small fists clenched despite his size. "Tommy, help your sister," the woman said as she accepted Will's hand to climb down from the wagon. She moved stiffly, as if she'd been holding the reins too long and her muscles had cramped. "I'm Helen Morrison. These are my children, Tommy and Sarah. Will Carter. This is my ranch." He guided them toward the porch, noting how Helen kept glancing back at the darkness behind them, as if expecting pursuit. "Let's get you folks inside before you catch your death." The heavy wooden door opened with a creak of wrought iron hinges, and warm light spilled out like a benediction. Will ushered them into his kitchen, where the coal oil lamp cast a golden glow across pine walls and braided rag rugs. The cast-iron stove radiated blessed heat. Sarah stopped shivering almost immediately, though she still clung to her mother's skirts. Tommy's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail: the exits, the corners where threats might hide, the poker beside the stove that could serve as a weapon. Too much wariness for a boy his age, Will thought. "Sit yourselves by the stove," Will said, pulling out chairs from around the scarred wooden table. I'll fetch some dry blankets and get coffee started. We don't want to be any trouble, Helen began, but Will was already moving toward the bedroom where his mother's quilts lay folded in a cedar chest. No trouble at all. Neighbors help neighbors out here. He returned with thick woolen blankets, the kind his mother had woven on her loom during the long winter evenings. These'll warm you up proper. Helen accepted the blankets gratefully, wrapping one around Sarah and another around Tommy before taking one for herself. Color was returning to the children's faces, though they remained silent and watchful. Will stoked the stove and put coffee on to boil, then ladled warm water from the reservoir into a ceramic wash basin painted with faded roses. Thought you might want to clean up a bit. There's soap and clean towels on the shelf. You're very kind, Mr. Carter. Helen's voice held a note of suspicion beneath the gratitude. Most men would want to know why a woman is traveling alone at night with children. Will met her eyes directly. Figure that's your business to tell or not. Right now, what matters is getting you warmed up and fed. He opened the warming oven above the stove and pulled out a covered pot. Got some leftover bean soup from supper. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling. The smell of food made Sarah's stomach growl audibly, and she pressed her hand over it in embarrassment. Will pretended not to notice as he ladled soup into 3 bowls and set them on the table with a plate of cornbread. Thank you, Helen said quietly, settling her children at the table. They ate with careful politeness despite their obvious hunger, the kind of manners that spoke of good upbringing even in desperate circumstances. Tommy finished first and looked up at Will with serious brown eyes. Sir, are there bad men around here? Helen's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Tommy, that's not... It's all right. Will pulled up a chair across from the boy. Depends what you mean by bad men. Son, most folks around here are decent enough. Why do you ask? Someone was chasing us. Mama made us leave real quick, and she kept looking back like she was scared. Will glanced at Helen, who had gone pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. We had some difficulties with our landlord. He wanted us to do things we couldn't agree to. The careful way she phrased it told Will everything he needed to know about the nature of those difficulties. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Well, you're safe here tonight. Storm's too bad for anyone to be riding around looking for trouble. We can't stay long, Helen said quickly. Just until the weather clears. We'll see about that tomorrow. Right now, you need rest. Will stood and moved toward the stairs. I'll make up the spare room. It's got 2 beds, one for you, ma'am, and one for the children. Where will you sleep? Helen asked. Parlor sofa suits me fine. Done it before when the house was full of company. Helen's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. I don't know how to thank you. You're risking a lot. Helping strangers. Will paused at the foot of the stairs, his hand on the newel post his father had carved 40 years ago. Outside, thunder crashed and rain hammered the roof. But inside, the kitchen felt warm and safe and alive in a way it hadn't for 3 long years. Ma'am, I figure if we can't help folks when they need it most, then what's the point of any of it? Dawn broke clear and cold over the ranch, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Will woke on the parlor sofa to the sound of quiet footsteps in the kitchen above. He'd slept better than he had in months, despite the unfamiliar surroundings of his own front room. When he climbed the stairs, he found Helen already dressed and moving efficiently around his kitchen. She'd rekindled the fire in the stove and set coffee to boiling in his blue granite pot. Sunlight streamed through the gingham curtains his mother had sewn, faded now by years of prairie sun, casting everything in a warm golden glow. Morning, ma'am. Will paused in the doorway, suddenly self-conscious about his rumpled clothes and sleep-tousled hair. Hope you found everything you needed. Good morning, Mr. Carter. Helen turned from the stove, and he saw that rest had restored some color to her cheeks. I took the liberty of starting breakfast. It's the least I can do to repay your kindness. You don't owe me anything. Will moved to the hand pump beside the kitchen window and worked the handle until clear water gushed into the ceramic basin. How'd you and the children sleep? Better than we have in weeks. Helen cracked eggs into a cast-iron skillet seasoned black with years of use. The beds are very comfortable. Your mother had good taste in quilts. She made most of them herself. Had a loom set up in the parlor where she'd worked during the winter months. Will splashed cold water on his face and dried it with a flour sack towel. She always said idle hands were the devil's workshop. Helen smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. My grandmother used to say the same thing. She taught me to sew and cook and keep house properly. The eggs sizzled in the skillet, filling the kitchen with the homey scent of cooking food. Through the window, Will could see Tommy exploring the yard while Sarah picked wildflowers near the porch. Both children looked rested and less fearful in the morning light. They seem better today, Will observed, nodding toward the window. Children are resilient, sometimes more than their parents. Helen turned the eggs with practiced ease. Tommy's been trying to be the man of the house since his father died. Too much responsibility for 8 years old. Will poured coffee into 2 cups and set them on the table. How long ago did you lose your husband? 2 years this fall. Pneumonia took him fast. 1 week he was healthy. The next he was gone. Helen's voice remained steady, but Will caught the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for the milk pail. Robert was a good man. Gentle with the children, worked hard, never raised his voice to me. Sounds like you were blessed to have him, even for a short time. Helen nodded, carrying the fresh milk to the table. I was, which is why I won't dishonor his memory by marrying a man like Marcus Blackwood. The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Will set down his coffee cup carefully. Blackwood. Heard that name around town lately. Buying up a lot of land, from what folks say. Buying, foreclosing, intimidating, whatever it takes. Helen's voice hardened. He owns the bank now, along with half the businesses in town. Came to me last week with a marriage proposal that wasn't really a proposal at all. How do you mean? Helen turned back to the stove, her shoulders tense. He bought Robert's debts from the previous bank owner, $300 plus interest. Due in full by November 1st, or he forecloses on our land. Will whistled low. $300 was more money than most ranch families saw in 2 years. That's a considerable sum. More than I could raise if I had 10 years instead of 1 month. Helen flipped the eggs with more force than necessary. Of course, marriage to Blackwood would settle the debt immediately, along with giving him control over my children and my life. And the land. Sits right between his holdings and where the railroad survey is supposed to go through. Convenient. Isn't it? Helen's laugh held no humor. He made it very clear that refusal wasn't really an option. Will felt anger building in his chest, a slow, steady burn like banked coals catching flame. What kind of man forces a woman into marriage? What kind of man threatens children? The kind who's never been told no by anyone in his life. Helen slid the eggs onto plates and added thick slices of cornbread from the warming oven. The kind who sees people as property to be acquired. Tommy burst through the kitchen door at that moment, his face bright with excitement. Mister, will you got chickens? And there's a barn with empty stalls. Can I help with the chores? Tommy, mind your manners, Helen scolded gently. Mr. Carter has been kind enough already without you pestering him for work. I don't mind. Will ruffled the boy's hair, noting how Tommy leaned into the gentle touch like a plant reaching for sunlight. Could use help gathering eggs and feeding the stock. Think you're up for it? Yes, sir. Tommy practically glowed with pride. Papa taught me how to handle animals before he got sick. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her arms full of black-eyed Susans and prairie grass. Mama, look pretty flowers for the table. They're beautiful, sweetheart. Helen found a mason jar and filled it with water from the hand pump. Mr. Carter, do you mind if we put these on your table? Course not. Been a long time since this kitchen had flowers in it. Will watched Sarah arrange her bouquet with serious concentration, her small tongue poking out in effort. My mother always kept wildflowers on the table during growing season. What happened to your parents, if you don't mind my asking? Helen settled into a chair across from him, her coffee cup warming her hands. Will was quiet for a long moment, studying the worn wood grain of the table his father had built from oak trees that grew beside the creek. Fever took them both 3 years back. Same winter storm that lasted near 2 weeks. By the time I could get to town for the doctor, it was too late. I'm sorry. That must have been very hard, losing them both at once. They'd been married 42 years, met when she was 16 and he was 18, fresh off the boat from Ireland. Papa always said he knew the minute he saw her that she'd be his wife. Will smiled at the memory. They went within a day of each other. Mama first, then Papa the next morning. Think he just couldn't bear the thought of being without her. Helen's eyes filled with unexpected tears. That's beautiful. And terrible. To love someone that much. Better to love and lose than never love at all, Papa used to say. Though I'll admit, some days I wondered if he was right. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the children chattering about the ranch and the animals and their plans for the day. Will found himself watching Helen when she wasn't looking, the way she cut Sarah's cornbread into manageable pieces, how she listened to Tommy's eager questions with patience despite her obvious exhaustion. Mr. Carter, Helen said eventually, I need you to understand that we can't stay long. Blackwood will be looking for us, and I won't bring trouble to your door. Seems to me trouble's already at your door, ma'am. Question is whether you face it alone or with help. Helen met his eyes across the table. Why would you want to help us? You don't even know us. Will considered her question carefully. Outside, morning light painted the valley gold and green, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window. For the first time in 3 years, his kitchen felt alive. Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything you care about. Maybe because a man like Blackwood needs to be stood up to. Or maybe because some things are just right, and helping a woman and her children is one of them. Helen nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression, guard dropping, walls coming down by degrees. Robert would have liked you, Mr. Carter. He always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated those who couldn't help him in return. Call me Will, and I think I would have liked Robert too. After breakfast, Will led Tommy out to the barn while Sarah skipped alongside, chattering about everything she saw. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed by the storm, and golden sunlight slanted through the cottonwoods that bordered the ranch yard. First thing a rancher learns, Will told Tommy as they entered the barn, is that the animals come before your own comfort. Stock gets fed before you eat breakfast, watered before you rest, sheltered before you sleep. Tommy nodded solemnly, taking in every word like scripture. Yes, sir. Papa taught me that too, before he got sick. The barn smelled of hay and leather and the comfortable mustiness of horses. Will's mare, Dolly, nickered softly from her stall, and the milk cow lowed expectantly from hers. A half-dozen chickens pecked around the floor, searching for scattered grain. Sarah, you want to help gather eggs? Will asked, noting how the little girl hung back near the door, uncertain. I don't know how, she whispered, twisting a fold of her calico dress between small fingers. Nothing to it. Just got to be gentle and talk nice to the hens. They're ladies, after all, and ladies appreciate good manners. Will took her hand and led her to the nesting boxes. Here, I'll show you. He demonstrated how to slip a hand carefully under the broody hen, speaking in low, soothing tones. There we go, Henrietta. Just want to borrow your egg for breakfast. Thank you kindly. Sarah giggled as the hen clucked and ruffled her feathers but didn't peck. She's not mean. Not if you treat her respectful like. Animals know when you mean them harm and when you don't. Will guided Sarah's small hand to collect the warm egg. See, easy as pie. Within minutes, Sarah was chattering to the chickens like old friends, telling them about the storm and the long ride and how her mama made the best cornbread in 3 counties. The hens seemed to enjoy the conversation, clucking back as if they understood every word. Meanwhile, Will showed Tommy how to measure out feed for the stock, how to check their hooves for stones, and how to curry brush the horses until their coats gleamed. The boy absorbed every lesson with eager attention, his small hands surprisingly capable for his age. "Your papa teach you about horses?" Will asked as Tommy carefully brushed Dolly's mane. "Some. We only had one old plow horse, but Papa said horses were God's gift to working men. Said they'd give you everything they had if you treated them right." "Smart man, your papa." Tommy paused in his brushing, his expression growing serious. "Mr. Will, are you going to make us leave?" The question caught Will off guard. "Why would you think that? 'Cause that's what always happens. Folks are nice at first, but then they get tired of us being around. Mama says we're a burden on people." Will crouched down to Tommy's eye level, his heart aching for the boy's too adult understanding of rejection. "Son, I want you to listen to me careful like. You and your sister and your mama aren't a burden on anybody. You're good people who've had bad luck, and good people help each other. That's just how it's supposed to be." Tommy's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to let fall. "Really, really, long as you want to stay. You got a place here." Will stood and handed Tommy a bone-handled whittling knife from his pocket. "This was my daddy's. Figured maybe you'd like to learn how to use it." The boy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Yes, sir. Can you teach me right now?" They settled on the porch steps, Sarah joining them with a bouquet of dandelions she'd picked from the yard. Will showed Tommy how to hold the knife safely, how to cut with the grain of the wood, how to shape a piece of pine into something recognizable. "What are you making?" Sarah asked, watching Tommy's careful movements. "Horse," Tommy said, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Like Dolly." Will guided the boy's hands, feeling the warm weight of him leaning against his shoulder. It stirred something deep in his chest, a paternal instinct he'd thought would remain forever unused. This was how it felt to teach your son, to pass down knowledge and skill and the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands. From the kitchen window, Helen watched them work. She'd spent the morning restoring order to Will's house, washing dishes properly, sweeping floors, organizing shelves that clearly hadn't seen a woman's attention in years. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that went beyond mere gratitude. She'd found Will's mother's things carefully preserved in a cedar chest, embroidered tablecloths, hand-hemmed napkins, a checkered tablecloth that had been saved for special occasions. Helen shook it out and spread it over the scarred wooden table, transforming the utilitarian surface into something warmer, more welcoming. In another drawer, she discovered jars of preserved peaches and green beans, enough to last through winter. The pantry held sacks of flour and cornmeal, wheels of cheese aging on wooden shelves, sides of bacon hanging from hooks. Will had been well prepared for solitary life, but now there were 4 mouths to feed. She added items to a mental list, things they would need if they stayed more than a few days: salt pork, fresh milk from the cow, vegetables from whatever garden plot might be established come spring. The thoughts came unbidden, as if her mind was already making plans despite her conscious intention to leave as soon as possible. At midday, she called them in for dinner: salt pork fried with onions, biscuits with butter and honey, coffee for the adults and fresh milk for the children. They sat around the table like a real family, conversation flowing easily between them. "Tommy's got good hands for whittling," Will reported, showing Helen the boy's first attempt at carving. "Few more lessons and he'll be making fine work. Papa tried to teach me once," Tommy said proudly, "but I was too little then. Now I'm big enough to handle a knife proper." Sarah showed off her egg-gathering skills, describing each hen's personality in elaborate detail. "Henrietta's the boss, but Beatrice is the friendliest, and Cordelia thinks she's too fancy for the chicken yard." Helen found herself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. The sound felt rusty from disuse, but good, like muscles stretching after long confinement. As afternoon wore into evening, new rhythms established themselves. Tommy helped Will with evening chores while Sarah assisted Helen in preparing supper. The kitchen filled with the comfortable sounds of domestic life, pots clattering, conversation flowing, the creak of chairs and footsteps on pine floors. After supper, instead of retiring to his solitary Bible reading, Will pulled the big family Bible from its place on the kitchen shelf. But instead of reading silently, he opened it to the book of Psalms and began to read aloud, his deep voice filling the lamplight kitchen with words of comfort and hope. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Sarah curled up in Helen's lap, drowsy from the day's adventures, while Tommy leaned against Will's chair, still working on his wooden horse. The scene felt ancient and timeless, a family gathered around the evening lamp, sharing stories and comfort at the end of the day. When it came time for bed, both children went willingly, their faces peaceful in a way Helen hadn't seen since before Robert's death. Tommy kissed her goodnight, then surprised them all by hugging Will around the waist. "Night, Mr. Will. Thank you for teaching me to whittle." "Night, son. Sleep well." "Yeah." Sarah followed her brother's lead, standing on tiptoe to hug Will goodnight. "Tomorrow can you show me how to milk the cow?" "If your mama says it's all right." Later, as Helen tucked the children into their beds, Sarah whispered, "Mama, can we stay here forever?" Helen smoothed her daughter's hair, her heart heavy with longing and uncertainty. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see." But as she listened to their quiet breathing in the darkness, Helen allowed herself to imagine what forever might look like in this place, this house where kindness dwelt, where her children could grow up safe and loved, where she might find peace after so much struggle. Outside, an owl called across the valley, and the lamp downstairs cast its warm glow against the windows, a beacon of home in the vast darkness of the frontier night. 3 days had passed in peaceful routine when the riders came. Will was teaching Tommy how to repair a section of split-rail fence when the sound of approaching horses carried across the valley. He looked up to see 3 men cresting the hill that overlooked his ranch, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sky. Something in their purposeful approach made Will's chest tighten with unease. These weren't neighbors paying a social call or travelers seeking directions. They rode with the deliberate intent of men on a mission, and Will had a sinking feeling he knew what that mission might be. "Tommy, go on up to the house," Will said quietly, setting down his hammer. "Tell your mama and Sarah to stay inside for a while." The boy's face went pale as he followed Will's gaze. "Is it them, the bad men?" "Don't know yet, son, but better safe than sorry." Tommy ran toward the house while Will straightened to his full height, his hands hanging loose at his sides. The riders were close enough now that he could make out details, well-dressed men on expensive horses, leather gun belts worn low on their hips, though their hands remained clear of their weapons. The lead rider was a thin man with a waxed mustache and cold gray eyes that took in every detail of the ranch yard. His companions flanked him on either side, one young and nervous, constantly shifting in his saddle, the other older and scarred, with the stillness of a man accustomed to violence. They reined up 20 feet from where Will stood, near enough to talk but far enough to maintain tactical advantage. The lead rider touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Afternoon. Name's Garrett, foreman for Mr. Marcus Blackwood. We're looking for a woman and 2 children who might have passed this way. Widow named Helen Morrison." Will met the man's gaze steadily. "Lot of folks pass through ranch country. What's your business with this particular widow?" "She's engaged to Mr. Blackwood. Seems to have gotten confused about the wedding date and wandered off with her children." Garrett's smile never reached his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood's concerned for her safety, traveling alone with little ones. Mighty considerate of him." Will kept his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." It wasn't quite a lie he hadn't seen Helen Morrison, the frightened woman who'd arrived 3 nights ago, the woman currently in his kitchen, humming as she prepared supper while her children played safely in his yard, was someone different entirely. "Now that's curious," Garrett said, nudging his horse a step closer. "Because we tracked wagon wheels leading right to your front door, fresh tracks from the night of that big storm." Storm brought all kinds of travelers through, offered shelter to a few folks, but they moved on come morning. The scarred rider spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco and hard living. You wouldn't lie to us, would you? Neighbor Mr. Blackwood don't take kindly to folks who interfere in his business. Will's hands remained at his sides, but his stance shifted slightly balanced, ready. And I don't take kindly to threats on my own property. Through the kitchen window, Will could see Helen's pale face watching the confrontation. Tommy and Sarah pressed against her skirts, their young faces tight with fear. The sight of those frightened children strengthened Will's resolve like steel being tempered in fire. No threat intended, Garrett said smoothly. Just want to make sure everyone understands the situation. Mrs. Morrison is Mr. Blackwood's intended bride. He has legal claim on her and those children. Anyone who helps her avoid that obligation is breaking the law. What law would that be? Will asked. Last I heard, a woman was free to accept or refuse a marriage proposal. Debt law, the young rider said, then flushed when Garrett shot him a warning look. That is, Mr. Blackwood holds paper on her late husband's obligations, makes things complicated. Will felt pieces clicking into place, the forced choice Helen had described, the desperate flight in the storm, the fear that still shadowed her eyes. Complicated how? Garrett regained control of the conversation. Point is, she belongs with Mr. Blackwood. We're here to take her home where she'll be properly cared for. Seems to me that's her decision to make. Sometimes folks don't know what's best for them. Sometimes they need guidance from wiser heads. Garrett's hand drifted closer to his gun belt, not quite touching, but making his intentions clear. Mr. Blackwood's offering good money for information about her whereabouts. $500 to anyone who helps bring her back safe. Will didn't miss the implied threat in that offer, $500 for cooperation, or consequences for obstruction. Generous man, you're Mr. Blackwood. Very generous, also very determined. The scarred rider's horse pranced restlessly, sensing his rider's tension. He gets what he wants, one way or another. That's so. Will took a step forward, his movement casual but deliberate. Well, you can tell Mr. Blackwood that if I do happen to see this Mrs. Morrison, I'll be sure to let her know he's looking for her. Of course. What she does with that information will be her choice to make. Garrett's eyes hardened. You're walking a dangerous line. Friend, Mr. Blackwood has influence in this county. Sheriff, judge, bank president, all good friends of his. Man could find himself in considerable trouble, standing against that kind of power. Could be. But a man's got to live with himself come morning. Will's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd made his decision and would stand by it regardless of consequence. And I sleep just fine knowing I've done right by folks who needed help. The kitchen door opened with a soft creak, and Helen stepped onto the porch. She'd changed from her work dress into her best calico, the one with tiny blue flowers that brought out her eyes. Her hair was neatly pinned, and she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who'd made her own decision about courage. Gentlemen, she said, her voice clear and steady. I believe you're looking for me. The three riders straightened in their saddles, hands moving instinctively toward weapons before stopping at Will's sharp look. He positioned himself between Helen and the mounted men, his body language making clear that any threat to her would have to go through him first. Mrs. Morrison, Garrett said, touching his hat again. Mr. Blackwood's been worried sick about you. Sent us to bring you home safe. How thoughtful. Helen's tone could have frosted glass in July. You can tell Mr. Blackwood that I'm perfectly safe where I am, and I have no intention of returning to discuss his generous proposal. Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. Helen stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. I understand that Mr. Blackwood believes he can force me into marriage by manipulating my husband's debts. I understand that he thinks a woman alone with children has no choice but to accept whatever terms he offers. And I understand that he's wrong. The young rider shifted nervously. But the debt will be dealt with according to the law. Real law, not the threats and intimidation Mr. Blackwood prefers. Helen's voice never wavered. I have friends now, Mr. Garrett. Friends who believe a woman should have the right to choose her own path. Will felt a surge of pride at her courage, even as he worried about the consequences. By standing up to Blackwood's men publicly, Helen had escalated the conflict beyond simple persuasion. There would be retaliation now, legal or otherwise. Garrett's face flushed with anger at being defied by a mere woman. You're making a mistake. Mrs. Morrison, both of you are making a mistake. His gaze swept between Helen and Will. Mr. Blackwood doesn't accept refusal gracefully. Then Mr. Blackwood will learn to live with disappointment, Will said quietly. Now I think this conversation's over. You're not welcome on my land. The three men sat their horses for a long moment, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Finally, Garrett nodded curtly. We'll be back, Carter, with Mr. Blackwood himself next time. And next time, we won't be asking politely. They wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving dust and implied threats hanging in the afternoon air. Will watched until they disappeared over the hill, then turned to find Helen watching him with something like wonder in her eyes. Why? She asked softly. Why would you risk so much for strangers? Will looked at the woman who'd brought life back to his empty house, at the children peering fearfully from the kitchen window, at the home they'd begun building together in just 3 short days. Because some things are worth the risk, he said simply, and you're one of them. 2 weeks later, Will woke to the sound of wagons approaching his ranch. Through the bedroom window, Helen had insisted he return to his proper quarters while she and the children took the spare room. He could see a small procession making its way down the valley road. Pastor Williams led the group in his black buggy, followed by 3 farm wagons loaded with people and supplies. The Miller family from the next valley over, the Hendersons from town, old Mrs. Patterson with her famous apple pies, and what looked like half the congregation of Millfield Community Church. Helen appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her best dark blue dress, her hair pinned up with tiny wildflowers Tommy had picked for her. Will, I think we're about to have company. Appears so. He pulled on his Sunday shirt, the white cotton crisp from Helen's careful ironing. Lot of company. Through the kitchen window, they watched the wagons pull into the yard. Children tumbled out first, followed by women carrying covered baskets and men unloading wooden chairs and tables. Pastor Williams approached the porch with a broad smile, his weathered Bible tucked under his arm. Morning, Will. Mrs. Morrison. He touched his hat respectfully. Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. Course not, Pastor, though I'm curious what brings half the county to my doorstep on a Saturday morning. Pastor Williams chuckled, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Well now, that's an interesting question. Seems word got around about your situation here, taking in a widow and her children, offering protection against Blackwood's bullying. Folks have been talking. Helen flushed, suddenly self-conscious. I hope we haven't caused any trouble. Trouble, Mrs. Patterson bustled up the porch steps, her gray hair escaping from its pins. Honey, you've given this community something to feel good about for the first time in months. Standing up to that snake Blackwood, showing folks that decent people still look out for each other. That's right, added Jim Henderson, setting down a wooden crate filled with mason jars. Blackwood's been pushing folks around too long. Time someone showed him that we're not all going to roll over and play dead. Will found himself surrounded by neighbors he barely knew, all talking at once about Blackwood's various schemes and intimidations. Apparently, Helen and the children weren't his first victims, just the first to find someone willing to stand up to him. Point is, Pastor Williams said, raising his voice to quiet the group, we figure if you're going to make a stand against Blackwood, you might as well do it proper. Can't have him claiming you're harboring another man's betrothed without legal consequence. Will felt Helen tense beside him. Pastor, I appreciate the sentiment, but now, I know what you're going to say. The pastor held up his hand. You hardly know each other. This is all moving too fast. What will people think? But sometimes the Lord puts people together for his own purposes, and it's not our place to question his timing. Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. Besides, anyone with eyes can see how those children have taken to you, Will, and how you've taken to them. That little girl follows you around like a baby duck, and that boy lights up every time you teach him something new. As if summoned by their words, Tommy and Sarah appeared from the barn where they'd been doing morning chores. Both children stopped short at the sight of so many people, then broke into delighted grins when they recognized familiar faces from church. Mrs. Patterson. Sarah ran to the elderly woman, who swept her up in a lavender-scented hug. Did you bring apple pie? 2 of them, sweetheart. And your mama told me you've been learning to gather eggs all by yourself. Tommy approached more shyly, still wearing the leather work gloves Will had given him. Morning, Pastor Williams, Jim, Mrs. Miller. He nodded to each adult with careful politeness. Look at you, boy, Jim Henderson said admiringly. Turning into a real rancher, I'd say. Will's been teaching you well. The boy beamed with pride. Yes, sir. He's showing me how to read cattle signs and mend harness. Says I've got good hands for the work. Will felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched Tommy bask in the community's approval. The scared, defensive child who'd arrived 2 weeks ago had blossomed into a confident young man under steady encouragement and purpose. Pastor Williams cleared his throat meaningfully. Which brings us to why we're here. Will, Helen, we'd like to propose something, a sort of community solution to your situation. Helen moved closer to Will, unconsciously seeking his support. What kind of solution? Marriage, Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. Simple as that. You two get married, legal and proper, with witnesses and everything filed official. Blackwood can't claim rights over another man's wife, and these children get the family they deserve. The words hung in the air like morning mist, visible but insubstantial. Will felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he glanced at Helen, trying to read her expression. They'd grown close over the past 2 weeks, sharing meals and conversation and the easy intimacy of domestic life. But marriage. I know it seems sudden, Pastor Williams continued gently. But sometimes circumstances require quick action. Blackwood's getting pressure from his investors to acquire your land. The railroad survey confirmed this valley as the preferred route. He won't give up easily. So you marry Helen, adopt the children legal-like, and present a united front, Jim Henderson added. Community backs you up, and Blackwood has to find another way to get what he wants. Will looked at Helen, seeing uncertainty and hope warring in her dark eyes. They'd been dancing around their growing feelings for days now, the way she hummed while working in his kitchen, how he lingered over coffee to hear her laugh, the comfortable silences that spoke of deep compatibility. Helen, he said quietly, what do you think? She was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy show off his whittling skills to the other children while Sarah distributed wildflower crowns she'd made that morning. I think, she said finally, that these are good people offering us a chance at the life we've both been afraid to hope for. And I think, Will replied, his voice rough with emotion, that I'd be honored to call you my wife and those children mine. The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd startled the chickens and set the horses nickering in the barn. Before Will quite knew what was happening, he was being hustled toward the cottonwoods while the women descended on Helen with tape measures and fabric samples. Can't have a proper wedding without a proper dress, Mrs. Miller declared, pulling a length of white organdy from her sewing basket. Lucky thing I brought my good needles. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The women transformed Helen's everyday calico into something approaching bridal finery with clever tucks and borrowed lace. While the men arranged chairs and tables under the shade trees, children were dispatched to gather armloads of autumn wildflowers, goldenrod and purple asters, black-eyed Susans and prairie grass. Pastor Williams found Will behind the barn, nervously adjusting his string tie for the 10th time. Second thoughts, son. Third and fourth thoughts, Will admitted. This is all happening mighty fast, Pastor. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones you don't have time to talk yourself out of. The older man settled against the barn wall, his weathered face kind. You love her. Will considered the question seriously. Did he love Helen Morrison? He loved the way she sang while cooking breakfast, the gentle patience she showed her children, the quiet strength that had carried her through widowhood and poverty. He loved how she'd brought laughter back to his empty house, how she listened to his stories about his parents without judgment or pity. Yes, he said simply, I believe I do. And the children? That was easier to answer. Tommy with his eager questions and determined courage. Sarah with her flower crowns and endless chatter they'd carved places in his heart from the first night. Feel like they're already mine. Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. Then you're ready to make this family official. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, conducted under the spreading branches of the cottonwood trees where Will's parents had been married 40 years earlier. Helen wore the white organdy dress with wildflowers in her hair, while Will stood proud in his Sunday best beside her. Tommy and Sarah flanked them, the boy wearing a necktie borrowed from Jim Henderson, the girl crowned with daisies and grinning from ear to ear. When Pastor Williams asked who gave this woman in marriage, Tommy stepped forward with solemn dignity. Her children do. We want Mr. Will to be our papa. There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering as Will knelt to the children's level. Tommy, Sarah, I promise to love you and protect you and teach you everything I know about being good people in this world. Will you have me as your papa? Yes, sir, they chorused, launching themselves into his arms with such enthusiasm that the entire crowd laughed through their tears. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of promises and rings. Helen's wedding band from Robert joined by a simple gold band Will had inherited from his grandmother. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was sweet and tentative, full of hope for the future they would build together. The celebration lasted until sunset, filled with fiddle music and shared food and the easy camaraderie of a community that had claimed this new family as their own. As evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the wagons loaded up and headed home, leaving the Carter family officially now to settle into their first evening as husband and wife, father and children. Later, as Helen tucked Tommy and Sarah into their beds, Sarah whispered, Mama, are we really going to stay forever now? Forever and always. Sweetheart, this is our home now. Tommy, already growing drowsy, murmured, Papa Will's going to teach me to brand cattle come spring. Helen smoothed his hair, marveling at how naturally the word Papa had come to him. I'm sure he will, darling. Downstairs, Will waited by the fireplace with 2 cups of coffee and the family Bible. When Helen joined him, he opened it to the page where marriages were recorded and carefully wrote their names in his best handwriting. William James Carter and Helen Grace Morrison, united in marriage. October 15th, 1883, witnessed by the community of Millfield. Below that, he added, children, Thomas Robert Morrison and Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, welcomed into the Carter family by adoption. Helen watched him write, her heart full to bursting. No more Morrison. We're all Carters now. All Carters, Will agreed, closing the Bible and setting it aside. For forever and always. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and an owl called across the valley. But inside their home, their sanctuary warmth and love and the promise of countless tomorrows filled every corner with golden light. The frontier had always been a place where people could reinvent themselves, where broken hearts could heal and new families could form from the ashes of old sorrows. Tonight, in this quiet valley where kindness had triumphed over force and love had conquered fear, that promise had come true once again. Will Carter's ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It had become proof that kindness creates family where blood cannot. What began with one man's simple decision to help strangers in a storm grew into a community united against injustice, demonstrating that moral courage spreads like ripples across still water. The true lesson lay not in grand gestures, but in daily choices. Will's decision to open his door without question, Helen's courage to refuse a forced marriage, the children's trust in rebuilding their hearts, the community's choice to stand together against a bully's power. Their story reminds us that family isn't just who we're born to, it's who chooses to stay when storms come calling. Gratitude flows both ways. Will gained purpose through protecting others, while Helen and her children found safety through accepting help with dignity intact. In a world where wealth and influence often silence the vulnerable, this frontier family proved that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they unite around shared values. Their sanctuary wasn't built with walls and weapons, but with welcome tables, patient teaching, and the radical act of treating strangers as kin. Sometimes the greatest victories happen quietly, in kitchens where coffee brews and children laugh, where broken hearts discover they can love again. Have you ever faced pressure to accept a situation that compromised your values, like Helen did with Blackwood's forced marriage proposal? How did you find the courage to choose your own path?